We have a couple of seniors that are participating this year, and I think the first one that I would call forward is Bethany. Bethany is involved in non-original oratory, and she is doing a piece originally written and performed, given by Angelina Jolie.
Sorry. We're here today to talk about millions of desperate families. Families so cut off from civilization that they don't know that a day like this exists on their behalf. Millions. And numbers can illuminate, but they can also obscure. So I am here today to say that refugees are not numbers. They're not even just refugees. They are mothers and daughters and fathers and sons. They are farmers, teachers, doctors, engineers. They are individuals all. And most of all, they are survivors, each one with a remarkable story that tells of resilience in the face of great loss. They are some of the most impressive people I've ever met, and also some of the world's most vulnerable. Stripped of home and country, refugees are buffeted from every ill wind that blows across this planet. Angelina Jolie, an advocate for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, shares her extraordinary experiences in a 2009 speech on World Refugee Day. Addressing not only the plight of refugees, but our common humanity, she shares the impact that refugees have had on her own life. This is A Sea of Humanity by Angelina Jolie. I remember meeting a pregnant Afghan woman in a completely abandoned camp in Pakistan. She couldn't travel when everyone else was relocated because she was too late in her pregnancy. She was alone with her 2 children and an older woman. There was nothing for miles around the camp, no other people in sight. So when they asked me to come in for tea, I said I didn't feel it was necessary. But being Afghans, they take pride in how they treat their guests. So they guided me into a small dirt hut with no roof to keep out the scorching heat, and they dusted off the 2 old mats that they ate, slept, and prayed on. And we sat, and we talked, and they were just the loveliest women. And then, with a few twigs and a single tin cup of water, they made the last of their tea and insisted that we enjoy it. Since before the parable of the widow's mite, it has been known that those who have the least will give the most. Most refugee families will offer you the only food that they have and pretend that they're not hungry. And the generosity of the poor applies not only to refugees. We should never forget that more than 80% of all refugee families have been hosted and have been for years and years in the poorest developing countries. Pakistan, a country now facing a crisis with over 2 million of its own people displaced, is still hosting 1.7 million Afghans and has hosted millions of Afghan families for nearly 30 years. I remember before we said goodbye to the pregnant woman, she pointed to a young boy. He had a dusty face and such a sad look. She explained that he's always asking for more food, and it hurts her to say that they have nothing. And then she asked if we would consider taking him. Would we take her son so that he could eat? She said it with tears in her eyes and with such a desperation unimaginable to every parent in this room. A few weeks later, the war in Afghanistan began and heavy fighting started right where they were. I've been back to that area 3 times since, and I look for them every time. The threat of climate change, the competition for resources, and ever-growing global inequality has created deepening, intractable conflicts. Whether it be Darfur, Myanmar, Swat Valley, or some as yet unknown crisis, mass migrations will be a feature of our future, and we must adjust to this living reality. And again, I would urge you to look beyond the simple numbers and look instead at the individual. I remember in Tanzania, I met a child in a tent. He sat on the dusty floor. He'd been shot in the back and left paralyzed. He crawled forward to shake my hand. He was no more than 15. He had big, pretty eyes and a big, wide, sparkling smile. And after all he'd been through, he was full of laughter and love. Later that night, I asked why he'd not been taken to a hospital or at least given a wheelchair. And I was told that his entire family had been killed, so there was no one to look after him. And he hadn't been accepted for asylum in a third country. The aid worker said they'd spent the money they could, but they didn't have any more. And I thought about him all night, and I'd wondered what I should do. The next day, I remembered as I walked through the camp, I saw more victims of war. I saw small children full of hunger and fear. I saw crying mothers, wounded fathers. I saw a sea of humanity, all desperate, all deserving. There were hundreds of thousands in that camp, and there are millions around the world. And at that time, I felt hopeless and overwhelmed by the realization of the magnitude of the problem. Then later on that trip, I met an 8-year-old girl who had seen her family killed in front of her. She grabbed her baby brother and escaped and survived, terrified and alone for 2 weeks. She was in the jungle and she managed to find bananas and feed herself and her brother. When I met her, she didn't talk. She just stared at the window. She rocked back and forth, and I kept trying to tell her how brave I thought she was. She just stared at the window. A year later, I came back to that same camp and I saw her again. She was very shy, but she was beginning to speak, and she was sweet and polite, but she still didn't care about chatting with me or visitors. She just wanted to know how her brother was. He was with the doctors, and she was just checking to make sure that everything was going to be okay. She was his mother now. That little girl had a depth and a strength that I will never know. And on that trip, and many that followed, I came to know refugees as not only the most vulnerable people on earth, but as the most resilient. As an American, I know the strength that diversity has given my country, a country built by what now some would dismiss as asylum seekers or economic migrants. But I'm convinced that we must convince the world that refugees must not simply be viewed as a burden. They are survivors, and they can bring those qualities to their communities and the countries that shelter them. If you see the individual, you see the education and knowledge that refugees pass on to their children, because often it is all they have to pass on. If you see the individual, you see the contribution that can be made by refugees to their host countries, and how influential they will be to their own land when eventually they return. In the last 9 years, I've made many visits to the field with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. I do it to raise awareness for the plight of refugees, but I also do it for me. The refugees I've met and spent time with have profoundly changed my life. The 8-year-old girl who saved her brother taught me what it is to be brave. The pregnant woman in Pakistan taught me what it is to be a mother. And the paralyzed boy who'd been shot in the back, with his big smile, showed me the strength of an unbreakable spirit. So today, on World Refugee Day, I thank them for letting me into their lives. And I thank you for coming.